Hello, everyone. My name is Adi Talati. I'm one of the directors of Grand Rounds, along with Doctors Rebecca Mueller and Alex Harris. Today, we have Dr. Mueller online with us. Just before we introduce today's speaker, I wanted to have a few announcements to make for the department. First of all, please remember the Grand Rounds will be followed by a lunch on the 6th floor multipurpose room, which is for trainees who have signed up. Also, next Wednesday is going to be the DeHersh Robinson Grand Rounds presented by Dr. Sharon Vaughn, who is the Manuel Justice Endowed Chair in Education at the University of Texas at Austin. The title of her talk will be Integrating Anxiety and Self-Regulation Within Reading Interventions. This talk will actually only be on Zoom, so please don't come to the auditorium for that. We also have a departmental announcement. There's a new training by the NISP Governance Board on the responsible conduct of research. These in-person trainings are 3 hours long and will be repeated 3 times over the course of 2 days on the 25th and the 26th of this month here in this NISP auditorium. Participation in one of these sessions is required if you're involved in human research. For more information, please contact the HRPP or Iris Delgado. For today's talk, it's hybrid, so we have people in the auditorium and we have people in Zoom. We'd like to encourage everyone to ask questions. If you're on Zoom, you don't have to wait till the end of the talk. You could post your questions while the talk is going on. Please use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature if you're asking questions. And if you're a trainee, either here in the auditorium or on Zoom, please identify yourself as such, as we like to prioritize trainee questions as well. And finally, if you're on Zoom and would like to ask the question yourself, please let us know. We'll prioritize you and make you a panelist temporarily. Now, today's Grand Rounds is a special Grand Round because it's hosted by the Institute of Developmental Sciences here. So I'm going to call its director, Dr. Bill Pfeiffer, to come to introduce our lovely speaker for today. Bill.
Thank you, Adi. Glad to see you all here and not on Zoom. I mean, I'm glad you people are on Zoom too, but it's especially nice to see everybody present. And by the way, Jay Gingrich would be here as the director of the new Institute for Developmental Sciences, but he's busy with his son at the World Robotics Competition. His kid won the local one, won the state one, they won the US one, and now they're in the global one. So anyway, Jay would love to be here. And he says hello, and so hopefully he'll be able to catch some of this by Zoom. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Koraly Perez-Edgar. She is the McCourtney Professor of Child Studies and a Professor of Psychology at the Penn State University. She received her AB from Dartmouth College, and I happen to win a number of awards along the way, as I noted from your CV. Speaking of which, I have to apologize. I destroyed what probably the equivalent of one sequoia tree because I printed it, the CV by mistake. But it's impressive if you ever get a chance to do that. She then went and got a PhD. What did I say this already? Received an AB from Dartmouth, PhD from Harvard University, where she worked under the mentorship of Jerome Kagan, sort of the father of what many of us consider the study of early temperament. She then did postdoctoral research with Nathan Fox at the University of Maryland, where I think you two are among the first to really delve into exploring electrophysiology to help understand what's going on while the behaviors that they were interested in were being emitted. In conducting her work, she really takes a truly multi-method approach from not just observing behavior in very sophisticated ways and studying cognitive functioning. She does psychophysiology, neuroimaging, and the EEG work that she's doing is one that most of us mimic when we are trying to do a good job anyway of trying to understand what's going on with the brain at the same time. She's been funded by every agency under the sun, among them NIMH, NIDA, NICHD, and NARSAD. And I won't go on and on, but just to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that Koraly is involved with, she is the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Developmental Psychology. She is also on, or has been on 12 editorial boards. I don't know which one of the 3 of you does that. This is one of the clones. I just wanted you to know that, because there's no way you could do all that stuff that you did. You have 2 really special edited volumes. I've stolen a couple of chapters from my classroom rather than pay for the books. But they're both, and one of them's on the Handbook of Emotional Development, and others on Behavioral Inhibition. So I mentioned that to you, so you might have a chance to take a look at them. has led several journal special sections, and you have something in the neighborhood of, I couldn't count that high, but it was 136 publications when I looked at her CV in November. I just looked again, and now it's 144. So since whatever that was, November till now, I don't know where you find the time to do that. And I've read some of these papers, and they're just excellent. I want to say just three more things. One of them is that just because I think it's so relevant to not only the work that Koraly does, but the number of people that she's influenced along the way. And other people have recognized that, where you even won special awards for teaching back as you were an undergraduate. You did that again when you were a postgraduate, and then you have also got a mentor award just recently from the Penn State University. And in addition to that, I also should say, I was going to ask Simon if he had a little hail to the chief going on, because Koraly is now going to be the newest president of my favorite society, Developmental Psychobiology, come the fall. So I want you to both look forward to learning something, learning about some very exciting research, and I'd like you to welcome Koraly to give us a talk.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And just to show you how much of it is a lie, usually I like to wear heels so that you will see me over the podium. Today I am not, because I managed to trip over a broom. So if you see me go like this, that's because I'm wearing flats, and so not smart enough to look at for a broom. All right, but we'll get started. Thank you all for coming, both in person and on Zoom. And what I wanted to do is take a moment and think about and talk about some of the work I've been doing now for 20 years, looking at behavioral inhibition as an underlying temperamental trait that we believe sets a foundation that allows us both to understand the mechanisms and identify treatment targets for the emergence of social anxiety disorder going into middle childhood and into adolescence. In doing that, the first thing I wanted to do was thank my lab, because they're the ones who actually do all of the work and come up with the wonderful ideas and create and operationalize some of the things we talk about together. I have no disclosures. We have some learning objectives, but we'll skip those. And let's talk about behavioral inhibition. So behavioral inhibition was initially, let me play this, and I'll speak over this. This is a behaviorally inhibited child that came into our laboratory at Penn State. The child is in a room with another child of the same age, same gender, and they've been left alone, and they've been told to get to know each other. There is another camera pointed at the other child, but you will see here, this is their attempt to get to know each other. And if you think about the initial formulation and definition of behavioral inhibition from the quintessential Kagan perspective, behaviorally inhibited child. Oh, that's the RA coming in to save the two of them. When you think about the behaviorally inhibited child, when confronted with social novelty, will freeze, withdraw, and refuse to engage. And it is this phenotypic trait that was first described, and then later over time, we found, not hypothesized, we found that behavioral inhibition increases risk for social anxiety disorder. And in fact, when you look at the meta-analyses, it's up to a 6-fold increase in risk. When you think about it in that way, it's a very pessimistic point of view. However, if you then, as always, play with the numbers, we can also say that about half of behaviorally inhibited children go on to show social anxiety, which means that half do not. So you can either think of it as a deterministic 6-fold risk, or you can think of it as a flip of a coin. And so the question becomes, how do we view this developmental trajectory? And then how do we take advantage of that coin flip to better understand the mechanisms and processes that lead to two diverging trajectories? One where you have a child that is a bit shy, a bit socially withdrawn, but fairly capable of dealing with the social environment, versus the child who reaches clinical levels of anxiety. The beautiful thing about behavioral inhibition, if you're a developmental psychologist, which is what I am, I'm not a clinician, is that it provides this pivot point. So that if we start at BI in young childhood, and we go prospectively, we can look at that trajectory going into social anxiety, whether clinical or subclinical. If we start at BI and go retrospectively, we can see that as early as 4 months of age, infants, when presented with both sensory and social novelty, there is a subset of those children who will arch the back, have vigorous limb movements, have negative vocalizations. These infants are considered negatively reactive, and infants who are negatively reactive have an increased risk or probability of being behaviorally inhibited. Infants, on the other hand, who are positively reactive in the same scenario have increased probability of being exuberant. And so we have both a precursor and an outcome of this one trait, and we can follow it over time. So just to reinforce what I said, that I wasn't lying to you, the meta-analyses are showing that across contexts, across cohorts, across operationalizations, early behavioral inhibition is our best known individual predictor of social anxiety emergence in children. We also know that it is a distributed neural network of regions that underscore and support this trajectory. So when I explained that initial negative reactivity, that's where Kagan initially considered this a limbic process, building on his own prior work in rat models, and the notion that if you have a rat confronting novelty, freeze, arch to the back, vigorous limb movements. What you saw in the 4 decades since this initial work, it is actually involving limbic areas, striatal area, prefrontal cortex, as the child needs to engage with and flexibly respond to the environment. Indeed, as an example from our own lab, we looked at the topographic analysis of neural connectivity. And what we did is we seeded across the anterior cingulate cortex, dorsal to ventral, and then looked at connectivity patterns with different ROIs of interest. So I'm going to show you here an example with ACC and the insula. What you'll see in blue here is our inhibited children, and in red is our non-inhibited children. And what you'll see is almost as expected, the non-inhibited children show this pattern of change in connectivity as you move across the ACC based on your expectation of different subregions of the ACC have different functional specificity in the work they do in the regions they're connected with. The inhibited children show this much flatter, non-specific pattern of connectivity. And then if you then take the next step and look at the relationship, here it's social phobia, because this was older data. We wouldn't call it social phobia now. It's for those children who show that flatter, non-specific pattern of connectivity that you also see increased risk for anxiety disorders and symptomatology. So that kind of lays the groundwork of this developmental work that started with this really interesting phenomenon seen in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So the question becomes, is this a Cambridge thing, like, Harvard children? Or is this something that's generalizable? The meta-analyses seem to say that is true. And it seems to be a way of pulling apart developmental mechanisms across levels of analysis, across time, and across contexts. And so this is where developmental psychologists and temperament researchers become very egotistical and chauvinistic. Because we would argue, and we have, that we were our doc before our doc was our doc. That we understood, or tried to, the question of underlying mechanisms, layers of analysis, that these things come together, and that at the phenotypic level, it presents as this categorical presentation, but it really is underlined by a number of processes come together over time and over levels of analysis. So we have this one paper written with some of my colleagues where we said, if you took the RDoc perspective on psychopathology and you said, well, how can we bring in temperament research for this in order to really give us specificity of these levels? Here's an example. So let's say we were thinking of being interested in looking at birth to 5 years. We're interested in risks for internalizing or some sort of anxiety, temperamental fearfulness, attention bias to threat, error-related negativity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this transition between high negative reactivity to behavioral inhibition to social reticence and withdrawal and anxiety. We can create this RDoC transition and movement by building and drawing from the temperament literature. From another perspective, this is a paper that just came out in December in the annual review of developmental psychology. Brendan and Osland and I tried to think about, well, how would you put this into a time grid? And if you think about some of the emerging work on fetal programming and postnatal, early perinatal processes, we can think of 3 children who are born with relatively low phenotypic risk. And yet, for some of these children, here, child A and child B, there's an experiential hit that increases their risk of moving into a trajectory towards anxiety. But that's not enough to determine risk for anxiety. And instead, what you have is a 2-hit model, which we've stolen from the cancer literature, that this second hit, if in a specific domain, in a specific developmental window, is why this child, flip the coin, moves into a social anxiety in adolescence, and this child, equally at risk, does not, right? Can we operationalize the timing and the structure of these experiential hits in order to understand developmental trajectories? And this is particularly important in the temperament literature because there's the danger of thinking of it as too deterministic, too biologically or genetically based. So this notion is like, oh, well, the baby's negatively reacted by 4 months. We're done, right? And no, it is this experiential process, the environment, that really is shaping these trajectories. So the whole debates and fistfights that used to happen at SRCD between the attachment literature people and the temperament literature people, we've seen to somewhat resolve a little bit. And so if you think about how do we then study this, how do we move from infant reactivity all the way up through social anxiety disorder, a number of people have come up with amazing, nuanced measures that help us understand these trajectories. I'm going to focus on one, attention to threat, just as a way of sort of honing our focus here for the next few minutes. The thing about attention, and it's lovely, is that smart people did the work before I came on board. There is a tight link between cognitive processes and neural processes when we think about attention. And because it is such a fundamental core filter for our daily experience, right? If we didn't selectively attend to our environment, we'd be frozen. We would be unable to engage and decide on how to move forward. So we must, from the earliest moments of life, whether reflexively or consciously, decide what we want to tend to. And so the work that's been emerging in the literature, both with adults and with infants, is how does attention shape these phenotypic profiles that we're interested in? So affect-biased attention as emotion regulation, and attention as a way that we shape the fears that children tend to present, either typically or atypically. And the clinical literature really latched onto this in the last 20 years, to the extent that there was an argument that attention biases to threat were causal for anxiety disorders, and that you simply had to use a computer program to reprogram attention biases, and you would cure, I hate using that word, social anxiety disorders, right? And so there was a lot of back and forth in the literature over this. And by a decade ago, that clean story of causality was already starting to fall apart. And so Bram here writes this paper where he goes, in sum, so we have some evidence for causality. It is not strictly unidirectional. And instead, it is best described as bidirectional, maintaining, and mutually reinforcing. Well, hot damn, that's where developmental psychology comes in, because that's what we've been trained, right? That's us, bidirectional, maintaining, and mutually reinforcing. So we come galloping in, right? And we think to ourselves, well, how do we measure attention? And here is Jose Ortega y Gasset. Tell me to what you pay attention, and I will tell you who you are. So how do we capture that in the first months of life? And admittedly, what developmental psychologists often tend to do is look at the adult literature. What are they doing? And can we make it kidified? And this is what the adult literature gave us, the dot probe task, right? You see two static, two-dimensional, non-contingent, prototypical views of an emotion face. And after these two faces leave, you see a probe, either in top or bottom, and you press a button. And depending on how quickly you press that button, depending if the probe is in the angry face location or in the neutral face location, you then do a simple subtraction. If the score is a negative, then you have an attention bias to threat. If the score is positive, you have an attention bias away from threat. Easy peasy. We've now captured attention bias. And we fell into this trap of conflating construct with measurement. At first, it's because it worked. And it was replicatable. English is a very odd language, replicatable. And so some of the work we did here, these are 5-year-olds. If you look at their behavioral inhibition as toddlers and their levels of social withdrawal as 5-year-olds in this little sort of simplified model, you can see the more biased they are towards threat, the stronger the correlation between early BI and social withdrawal. This was really exciting because a year earlier, we had showed that 15-year-olds were showing the exact same relationship. And so easy peasy. The problem is that none of this really held up over time because the psychometrics of the task turned out to be very poor. And when you look at our own data from infants, biases are normative. So this is a sample of 357 infants recruited from State College, Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Newark, New Jersey. There is no notion of biases being some outlying marker of risk once it's embedded within the overall pattern of processing. And indeed, when we look at our own sample of 8 to 12-year-olds, there's literally nothing here that you can make out of this figure, right? You have the non-inhibited, you have the inhibited, and here you have your threat biases, and here's the correlation between threat bias and behavioral inhibition. It is literally a null, right? And so my student and I started thinking about, well, how do we go from Bram, who wrote this beautiful paper calling for bidirectionality, mutual reinforcing processes, and try to do that work with the dot probe task. And what Jessie talked about, she's now an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, is that we've gone about this the wrong way. What we really need is to study real time, within person change in attention, because when we do that and move away from screen-based tasks, we allow the participants to selectively attend to and navigate across competing stimuli. And this allows us to look at both greater ecological validity, but also the very things we're interested in. How do people navigate their social world and decide whether to turn left or to turn right, to advance or to retreat? Unless you give them the opportunity to show us, we will never know. And so what we want to do is move away from the dot probe and go to here, right? She's standing in front of a crowd. It looks like most of the crowd was quite happy with the talk, except the one person. And her response is not, oh, I wonder what's up with him. Her response is, they hated me. And you have enough experiences where your interpretation and subjective belief is they hated me, you're going to be less and less likely to engage. Here you have an older person in front of a crowd speaking. Think of it as a 7-year-old in 2nd grade. The kids don't like me. Well, why would you go back to a place where the kids don't like you? They hated me. And here's what we want to see. This is the attentional conflict of interest.
Everyone knows. Everyone knows. They're talking about me. They saw everything. He knows, she knows, they know. Wow, she's super tall. Why is he smiling? Am I the weird guy now? What am I doing? How do I stop? Can they hear my thoughts? Why are all my thoughts so loud?
Right? That is the danger of the social environment. That is what we want to capture. And so our first iteration, our first generation of work was looking at mobile eye tracking using these glasses from Pupil in Germany. The glasses we use now look like glasses. They look like you could put them on and walk through the street and nobody would notice. This iteration, of course, you could never do that. But the loveliness about them is they have two cameras looking into each retina so we can see the tracking of the eye. We have one camera capturing the world view, and then we can overlay the world view cameras with the retina cameras to look at scan paths and eye gaze, much like you would in front of computer doing a stationary eye tracking task. So here's what our first thing is. How do children take on the world using selective attention as a proxy for all of the other much more sophisticated and nuanced attentional processes we're really interested in? And so for this first study, this is the first sort of pilot. This is Norbert, who was an RA at the time, is about to graduate from medical school here in New York City, about to be a pathologist. And he's sitting here being the creepy stranger. He's sitting in a room, he's got the hat on, and here is our 5-year-old, very cute boots. And this is his eye. This is his eye. And this is the scan path. It's hard to see, but you can see here, they're moving back and forth. And what Jessie did is she hand-coded fixation by fixation. Where is the child looking? And what is happening in the room? So is the child looking at an object? Is the child looking at the stranger? Is the child looking at the self? And in that moment in time, is someone speaking or someone being quiet, right? To overlay that process. And then you can create a state space grid. So to represent two children, one with behavioral inhibition and one without, you notice here that this behaviorally inhibited child spends most of the interaction saying nothing and looking at his lap or his fingers, right? This is the social interaction. And you can think back to that video I showed at the beginning. This non-inhibited child, it is not as if they're a chatterbox. It is not as if they're a poised, public speaker, but they're looking at the stranger. They sometimes speak, right? Typical 5-year-old behavior. And what she found that was really interesting is that if you tried to compare performance on the dot probe, which we made all the kids do, and performance in the stranger task, the only real correlation you found was among the behaviorally inhibited children, where you see some carryover across contexts for their performance in social tasks. So I want to pivot and show you two of the initial tasks we used. There's a number of others, but we're going to start here. And the first is to try to capture the nuance of changes in attentional processes and then the environment's response to those among young children. So here's a mother and child. They're being asked to do a difficult puzzle. We asked the parents, do not touch the puzzle pieces, simply give verbal support. And now, of course, parents are listening to our instructions. Kids could not care less. And this is where you see.
What do we do?
I don't know. Okay, let's.
Help me.
I'm trying to, sweetheart. So let's look here.
Help
All right, so we
me.
have our big triangle. We have an upside down triangle. So that looks right. And it goes over to here. So that looks right. What about, yes, look, I think we need to do something right around here. Do you see this? So this part right here is this right here. So leave it like that. Leave it like that.
Right. So stop there, right? Pretty soon she's taken over. She's doing the puzzle. Child is very happy. And what we can do again with the state space grids is look at in real time how they're moving through this process of parental behavior, the child behavior, and how that shapes the outcomes. And are there individual differences here? And so if we do a little more complicated state space grid, you can see that for some families, and again, this is very judgmental. Developmental psychologists can be judgy. We label some behaviors as directive and as teaching. And for some families, they tend to fall within these quadrants. And then we get very judgy and we call some behaviors as intrusive, right? and controlling. And here for some families, you can see that they tend to fall more into these areas of our quadrant. But what's really interesting is that you think about parental anxiety here, and then the adjusted effect of behavioral inhibition on parental controlling behavior. What you see is that as parental anxiety increases, there is a greater and tighter link between the child's behavioral inhibition and the likelihood that the parent will engage in controlling behavior. Because remember, you're a mom in a room and your child is saying, help me, not passive. This is evocative. And there are some children that are more likely to say, help me than others. And now you're asking this mom in that moment in time to decide, do I let them struggle a bit more or do I support them in that moment? And for the more anxious the mom is, the more likely they're going to come in and rectify that situation. So you see this interplay between the child characteristics, maternal characteristics, and that struggle we created for them in that moment. And so that's where we see some of the behaviors with the family. But one of the things that's really interesting about behavior inhibition, social anxiety, and the temperament literature is this focus on acute fear and threat, and how attention to threat is supposed to be very important in that process. So there we took a task from the lab tab battery and called Scary Mask. And this is what one child looks like in that process.
Okay, so Hadley, I'm gonna take you to this room and let you play here for a little bit. I'm gonna come back in a couple of minutes, okay?
Dance again.
Hi, my name is Jamie. Hey, sorry, I was just playing with some Halloween costume. So it's not real, it's not gonna hurt you. Would you like to feel it? Yeah, see? It's not real. Go ahead and touch the mouth. Yeah?
Well, the thing you would expect is that behaviorally inhibited children would behave differently than non-inhibited. And in fact, you get the exact opposite. There is no behavioral difference in terms of proximity duration of fear as a function of behavioral inhibition. And this is actually replicating another cohort that Kristen Buss had, where again, she did this task, no behavioral differences. But then we look at the eye tracking, and here we use some conditional growth curve model. Using behavioral inhibition as a continuous predictor. And what you see, I don't know where that's coming from. And what you see is that the pattern of a visual attention when the mask is on and then when the mask is off is quite dramatic, as the children are taking in information in order to decide of just how threatening is this situation. And when you look at BI, you have both a main effect of time and time squared, but a significant effect of behavioral inhibition. And in this case, you do see that attention to threat. They pay more attention to threat, and they have higher attention at the early onset of the mask off, and then collapse to look like their non-inhibited peers. When it is this animal is not going to kill me or eat me. And then here's one where we did some dyadic interactions. So these are two children. They've never met before. They come into a room, and there is a room full of toys. Now, again, one of the difficulties of this type of task is that you're never quite sure what the children are going to do. And so you have to define trials and patterns after the fact. You don't have predefined trial numbers and what are they going to do. So it turned out 80% of the kids played Chutes and Ladders. That was it. That was the big winner of the day. So here you have child A, and they are looking at the card being held by child B. These are her eyes. And here is child B, who is looking at child A's face as they are being shown, if they're showing the card, right? So you can overlay the visual attention from both partners moment by moment by moment. And when you think about our literature and our intuitions about what fun, interactive, social dyads should be, especially when you compare that to our intuitions about atypical development. And here I'd like to evoke the notion of, say, a child on the autism spectrum disorder, right? Flat affect, doesn't look at the other person's face, is not engaged. But then when you actually get real living children in activities, this is what you get. There is very little to no negative affect. These are very well-behaved, socialized German farm kids in the middle of central Pennsylvania, right? They're not going to act out. There's not that much positive affect, right? The vast majority of the time is spent in this neutral tone that is conducive to social interactions with a new stranger, someone you've just met. And most of the time, they're engaged with a toy. They're playing the game together. There is some looking at the peer, some looking around the room, but it is really task-oriented. They are playing this game, they're enjoying it, but they're quite, even keeled about it. We don't get what we think is this jubilant, I'm looking at your face, you're my new friend, I'm smiling the whole time. What we do instead see is contingency differences. So here on this axis, we have behavioral inhibition, and here we have self-expressed affect. So the affect shown by child A. Peer-expressed affect is the affect shown by child B. And what you see, if the peer is showing positive affect, there is this huge variability in whether I will show positive affect in return as a function of behavioral inhibition. So non-inhibited children show a lot of variability on whether they contingently respond to positive affect with positive affect. It's at this end of the spectrum, when you're highly inhibited, you're much less likely to respond contingently with positive affect. And one could argue this is what other children are picking up on. They're smiling, you're not smiling back. So it's not the overall level of positive affect that's different between these kids, it's the contingency of that interaction. And with neutral affect, there's very little probability of what's going to happen next. And remember, they spend most of their time in neutral affect. So what do we do next? Well, we need riskier behaviors, right? We're in the lab, it's sort of safe. What could happen to you? We're trying to do more social dyads, and we're trying to look at more intergenerational transmission. How do we process this in a more nuanced and dynamic way? And in doing so, we're trying to first test out, can we nibble at the edges in this notion of first, second, and third person science? So a lot of the work that's been done historically lives here. One brain staring at a non-contingent screen, Nimston faces, for example, which I love and I use all the time. Then you have a single brain looking at a video, right? Or another person. Some dynamism has been introduced into the process. And here is where you're thinking about potentially getting more contingency and synchrony, two brains in action, either serially or in the moment, real-time synchronous behavior between two individuals engaged in a task. And as with a lot of the things we do in our lab, we start with adults, young adults, well, undergrads, whatever you want to label them, and see if we can then scale it down. So in this first task, which was funded by Alicia Valerani's F31 and now her F32, we have two best friends. They've come into the lab, they're wearing mobile eye tracking glasses, and they're interacting. In the videos, we can then strip out concrete, discrete moments of positive affect, negative affect, and neutral affect, and create videos from them. We then bring them both back into the magnet and they re-watch these videos to look at neural similarity as a function of what they're watching and their social relationships. Now, when we look at these types of data, there are 4 types of runs that we can run. The first is what we would call, well, the first and the second are the standard runs you would look at in a neural similarity task. 2 people looking at the same video, right? In this case, they're both looking at participant A. Or in this case, they're both looking at participant B. But you can also now flip the script. And here is participant A looking at himself and participant B looking at himself. But you're comparing neural similarity between 2 different videos that happen to coincide in time. And then you can really flip the script and say participant A looking at the situation from another person's point of view, a perspective they would never have had in real life, right? So you can relive the experience and remember it, and you can also newly live through it from the perspective of your best friend. And when we look here and we look at shared affect across the interaction, and we look at neural similarity, what we find is when we have this new novel perspective where you're looking at the world from the point of view of someone else, as shared affect goes up, neural similarity goes up. So for the first time, we can see how this social bond is being supported by an underlying neural process that normally would not have been able for us to tap into with our traditional technology of videos in the room, right? We can also look at more social situations. I won't show this whole video. After school.
Freeze Builder 8. How do you freeze them?
And you notice they don't look at each other's faces.
Builder 8. 9! I'm Builder 9, I think. No, I'm not. I think I'm Builder 9. Am I Builder 9? What number am I? What number am I? Freeze Builder 6.
Has anybody been frozen?
No, but Matei's gonna freeze them. Hello.
So imagine coding an afternoon of eye gaze patterns in a classroom. We're trying to figure out how to do that with machine learning. The other thing we're doing, again, is trying to move into that more contingent in the moment, is using FNIRS in the lab. Here is a parent and child doing a puzzle task, much like the one I showed earlier with mobile eye tracking. FNIRS is lovely in that it is more resistant to movement than, say, EEG, and certainly allows for more movement than being in the magnet, but gives you at least some sense of cortical activity in the moment. And much like a simple time series correlation, you can look at neurosynchrony between parent and child as they interact with each other. And so just to give you a snippet of our first data, it's the child doing a modification of the DB-DOS. There's the block with free play. There's the stressful context where we give them puzzles that are way too difficult, and we time them and we add the pressure, and then they go back to free play again, a recovery phase. And what we find is, as expected in the little bit of the literature we have, synchrony increases as the child moves from free play to the stressful context, and then decreases again as you move back to the recovery phase. What we see that's different is that if you take into account the child's temperament, it is not negative fearfulness or that influences this pattern. It's inhibitory control and effortful control. When the child has greater levels of effortful control, that shape, that triangle is steeper and the recovery is faster. Almost as if, to anthropomorphize the brain, they're pulling in the resources of the parent and regulating the stress that's coming from this situation. However, when we look at parental anxiety, the triangle is now flatter. Anxious parents are less inclined to synchronize with their child and then move into recovery with them in a synchronized pattern. We're trying to figure out what this means. We have about 100 dyads right now. This is, visit 1. We're going to eventually have 300 dyads with 3 time points of data. But what we're at least seeing is that there is a lawful relationship between early stressors, the implementation of a compensatory component between parent and child, and then recovery, and that there are individual differences in how that plays out. The question becomes, when we go to visit 1, visit 2, visit 3 over the course of 2 years, does that trajectory help us understand anxiety in any way? Is neurosynchrony one of the conduits for this intergenerational transmission of anxiety? And from there, I'll stop because I've used up almost all my time. But just to summarize, we have these early individual differences across integrated processes that can be linked to individual differences in temperament. They're visible in the first months of life. That capturing behavior while the child is actually behaving is going to help us understand social behavioral development, as opposed to capturing processes of looking at cues that are suggestive of behavior. And that we need to add the child's worldview to create these multidimensional profiles. It is the child's experienced environment that they present with to us, either in the lab or in the clinic. And whether we can say, well, that's objectively not true, doesn't really matter if subjectively that is the way the child is viewing the world. And it is that subjective mechanism that is leading to the behaviors that are either helpful to them or are maladaptive and worrisome. And so in that sense, I hope that the data we're generating in our lab is both clinically informed and clinically relevant so that they can then be taken up and used in a much more applied and helpful manner. And with that, I'll stop.